Grace Whitmore's hands were turning black from the cold. Her 2-year-old daughter burned with fever so high that steam rose from the child's skin into the frozen Wyoming night. Behind her, 4 more children stood shivering, waiting for their mother to get up one more time. She looked at her blackened fingers. She looked at her dying child. Then a cowboy appeared out of the storm and said 4 words that would change everything. But to understand how Grace Whitmore ended up in that blizzard with 5 children and nowhere left to run, we need to go back 3 days. To a train platform. To the moment her last hope walked away. The late afternoon sun hung low over Silver Creek Station, casting long shadows across the empty platform. Grace Whitmore stood perfectly still, one hand gripping the handle of a battered trunk, the other holding a crumpled piece of paper she had read so many times the ink had begun to smear. Behind her, 5 children huddled together in a tight line. The oldest, Rebecca, kept her arm around the youngest 3-year-old Lily, whose face was buried in her sister's worn coat. Matthew stood apart from his siblings, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid, staring at the mountains in the distance as if willing them to provide an answer his mother could not. Grace looked down at the paper again. The words hadn't changed. Prosperous rancher seeks educated wife. Must value hard work and be of strong moral character. Children welcomed, replied to J. Brennan, Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory. She had replied, 3 letters in fact, each one carefully written by candlelight in a Philadelphia boarding house that charged by the week. The rancher had written back. His penmanship was neat, his words measured. He seemed educated, reasonable. He had asked about her children and she had answered honestly. Well, mostly honestly. She had written children in the plural. She had not specified that plural meant 5. The rancher had sent money for train tickets, enough for 6 passengers second class. Grace had spent the last of her own money on food for the journey and arrived in Silver Creek with $1.27 in her reticule. A man had been waiting at the station when the train pulled in 2 hours ago. He had looked at Grace, then at Rebecca, then at Matthew, then at Emma, then at Oliver, then at Lily. His face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, anger, finally disgust. Letter said 1 or 2 kids, he had said, his voice flat. Not a whole damn orphanage. Grace had opened her mouth to respond, but the man had already turned away, climbing into his wagon without another word. She had watched him drive off, dust rising behind the wheels, until he disappeared around the bend in the road. That had been 2 hours ago. Now the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping, and Grace Whitmore stood on an empty train platform in a town where she knew no one with 5 hungry children and $1.27. Mama, Emma said quietly. She was 9 years old and still believed her mother could fix anything. Are we going back to Philadelphia? Grace looked at her daughter, at all 5 of her children. Their faces were clean, their clothes patched but neat. She had made sure of that. No matter how little money they had, no matter how desperate things became, her children would not look like street urchins. They would hold their heads high. They would remember they came from good people, even if those people had made terrible mistakes. No, sweetheart, Grace said, her voice steady. We're not going back. Ever. Matthew turned to look at her, then his young face hard with anger he was too young to carry, but had been forced to bear anyway. Then where are we going? He asked. We got nowhere to stay. We got no money. That man left us here like we were trash. Grace felt the words hit her chest like stones, but she did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch. Flinching showed weakness, and if her children saw weakness in her, they would break. She could not allow that. We'll figure it out, she said. We always do. She picked up the trunk with both hands, the weight of it pulling at her shoulders. Inside were clothes, a Bible that had belonged to her father, a few books, and a small wooden box containing the last pieces of jewelry her mother had left her. Not much, but it was all they had. Come on, she said. Let's find a place to stay tonight. The town of Silver Creek was small, one main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church at the far end with a white steeple that caught the last rays of sunlight. Grace led her children toward the general store, hoping the proprietor might know of a boarding house or at least be able to tell her where she could find work. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Inside, the store smelled of flour and tobacco and leather. Barrels of goods lined the walls. Shelves stacked with canned foods and dry goods reached nearly to the ceiling. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined but kind. The woman looked up as Grace entered, her eyes moving from Grace's face to the 5 children trailing behind her. "Good evening," Grace said. "I'm looking for a place to stay. Do you know of any boarding houses in town?" The woman studied her for a moment, taking in the worn coat, the careful posture, the way Grace held herself with a dignity that poverty had not yet managed to strip away. "You the mail-order bride for Brennan?" the woman asked. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I was supposed to be. The arrangement fell through." The woman nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I see," she said. "Well, there's Mrs. Patterson's boarding house 2 streets over. She charges 50 cents a night. Meals are extra." Grace did the math in her head. 50 cents a night meant her money would last 2 nights. Maybe 3 if they didn't eat well. "Thank you," Grace said. "And do you happen to know of anyone hiring I can cook, clean, keep books? I was educated back east." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Hayes," she said. "I own this store. As for work, well, that's harder to say. Most folks around here do their own cooking and cleaning, and the ranches that hire help usually hire men." Grace nodded, expecting as much. "I understand. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Hayes." She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, the door opened behind her and 3 women entered. They were dressed well, their clothes marking them as women of means in this small frontier town. The one in front was perhaps 45, with dark hair shot through with silver and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Martha, dear," the woman said, her voice honey-sweet. "Is this the woman everyone's talking about? The one who arrived with all those children and no husband?" Martha Hayes shifted uncomfortably behind her counter. "Mrs. Pierce," she said carefully. "This is Mrs. Whitmore. She's new to town." The woman called Mrs. Pierce turned her attention to Grace, her gaze moving slowly from Grace's face down to her worn boots and back up again. It was the kind of look designed to make a person feel small. Grace had experienced that look many times in Philadelphia. She had learned how to endure it. "Whitmore," Mrs. Pierce said, drawing out the syllables. "Any relation to Daniel Whitmore of Philadelphia, the embezzler who hanged himself?" The store went silent. Grace could feel Martha Hayes' eyes on her. She could feel her children pressing closer behind her. Matthew's hand found hers and squeezed tight. Grace straightened her spine. "He was my husband," she said, her voice clear and cold. "He's dead. I had no part in his crimes. My children had no part in his crimes. We came here for a fresh start." Mrs. Pierce's smile widened, showing teeth. "A fresh start," she repeated. "My dear, Wyoming is a small territory. Shame travels fast. If you think anyone in this town will hire a woman with your reputation, you're sadly mistaken." Grace felt the words land like a physical blow, but she refused to let it show. She had survived worse than the judgment of small-minded people. She had survived her husband's disgrace, his death, the loss of their home, the cruel whispers of her former friends. She had cut Daniel's body down from the cellar beam with her own hands while her children slept upstairs, unaware their father was gone. She had sold everything they owned to pay his debts and still been thrown out of their house by creditors who did not care about 5 fatherless children. She had survived all of that. She would survive this. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Pierce," Grace said, "but I'll manage." She turned and placed a few coins on the counter for Martha Hayes. "2 loaves of bread, please," she said. Martha wrapped the bread quickly, her hands shaking slightly. She pushed one of the coins back toward Grace. "1 loaf is 5 cents, she said quietly. "Keep the change." Grace looked at the woman, saw the sympathy in her eyes, and felt something in her chest tighten. Sympathy was harder to bear than cruelty sometimes. Cruelty made you strong. Sympathy reminded you of everything you had lost. "Thank you," Grace said softly. She took the bread, divided it among her children, and walked out of the store. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Pierce's voice rising in animated conversation, the words "scandal" and "improper" floating out into the evening air. Outside, the sun had set completely now. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Grace looked up and down the street, searching for the boarding house Mrs. Hayes had mentioned, but her mind was racing too fast to focus. 50 cents a night, 2 nights of shelter, maybe 3. Then what? If no one in town would hire her, what would they do? They couldn't go back to Philadelphia. There was nothing for them there but debt collectors and shame. But they couldn't stay here without money, without work. Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the panic that threatened to overwhelm her whenever she allowed herself to think too far ahead. She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. One thing at a time, find the boarding house. Get the children fed and warm. Figure out the rest tomorrow. She opened her eyes and saw a man standing across the street watching her. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore simple clothes, brown trousers, a worn shirt, a hat pulled low over his eyes. He sat astride a large bay horse, one hand resting on the saddle horn, utterly still. Grace looked away quickly. She had learned to be wary of men who stared. In Philadelphia after Daniel's death, men had approached her with offers that were insulting in their transparency. They had seen a desperate widow and assumed she would be grateful for any attention. They had been wrong. She gathered her children and started walking toward the far end of the street, following Martha Hayes's directions. But when she glanced back, the man was still there, still watching. Grace quickened her pace. They found the boarding house just as the church bells rang 7 o'clock. It was a 2-story wooden structure with a sign hanging above the door, Patterson's Rooms. Grace knocked, and after a moment, a stout woman with a flour-dusted apron opened the door. "Yes, Mrs. Patterson, I'm looking for a room. Mrs. Hayes at the general store directed me here." Mrs. Patterson looked at the 5 children, and Grace saw the calculation in her eyes. 6 people meant 6 people's worth of wear on the linens, 6 people's worth of noise, 6 people's worth of potential trouble. 50 cents a night, Mrs. Patterson said. Meals are extra. Breakfast is 10 cents, supper is 15. No cooking in the rooms, no loud noise after 8 o'clock. Grace did the math again. 50 cents for the room, another $1.50 for food for all 6 of them if they ate breakfast and supper. That was $2 total. She had $1.27. "I can pay for tonight," Grace said, "and I can work off the rest. I'm a good cook and housekeeper. I can help with cleaning or laundry." Mrs. Patterson's expression did not change. "I don't need help," she said. "I need paying customers." Grace felt Matthew tense beside her. She put a hand on his shoulder. "Please," Grace said, and hated the sound of the word in her own mouth. She had sworn never to beg, but this was not for her. This was for her children. "Just one night. I'll find work tomorrow. I'll pay you double tomorrow night." Mrs. Patterson looked at the children again. Lily had started to cry softly, her small face pressed against Rebecca's coat. Oliver stood silent, his eyes too old for a 6-year-old boy. Emma was trying to smile, trying to pretend everything was all right. The woman sighed. "One night," she said, "but if you can't pay tomorrow, you're out." "Understood. Understood. Thank you, Madam." Patterson led them upstairs to a small room with 2 narrow beds and a single window overlooking the street. It was clean but sparse. Grace thanked her and closed the door, and for the first time since they had left Philadelphia, she allowed herself to sit down. The children gathered around her. Rebecca divided the remaining bread into 6 portions. Grace took the smallest piece and made sure each child ate before she did. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Rebecca asked. She was 14 and had been forced to grow up too fast. Grace could see the worry in her daughter's eyes, the same worry she worked so hard to hide from the younger ones. "I'll find work," Grace said, "tomorrow." "But that lady said nobody would hire you." Grace met her daughter's eyes. "That lady was wrong," she said firmly. "There's always work for people willing to do it. We'll be fine." She did not know if that was true, but she said it with enough conviction that Rebecca nodded and passed a piece of bread to Oliver, who took it without speaking. That night, Grace lay awake long after the children had fallen asleep. She could hear Lily's soft breathing, Matthew's occasional restless movement, Rebecca's whispered reassurances to Emma, who had woken from a nightmare. Through the thin wall, she could hear other guests moving about, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of voices. She thought about Daniel, about the man he had been when they married and the man he had become, about the lies he had told her, the debts he had hidden, the shame he had brought upon their family. She thought about finding him in the cellar, about the choice she had made to protect her children from that final horror. Grace closed her eyes and pushed the memory away. Dwelling on the past would not feed her children. It would not find them a home. It would not give them a future. She would find a way. She always did. At dawn, Grace woke the children and used the last of their water to wash their faces. She brushed and braided the girls' hair, made sure Matthew's collar was straight, checked that Oliver's shoes were tied. Then she led them downstairs and out into the cold morning air. The town was just beginning to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few early risers moved along the street, heading toward work or opening their shops. Grace walked back to the general store, hoping Martha Hayes might know of someone who needed help. But when she arrived, she found Mrs. Pierce and two other women standing outside the store, blocking the entrance. They were speaking loudly enough to be heard by anyone passing by. "I heard she's been asking for work," one of the women said, "as if any respectable person would employ the widow of a criminal." "She should have stayed in Philadelphia," another added. "We don't need her kind here." Mrs. Pierce saw Grace approaching and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I do hope you slept well. Such a pity about your situation. But as I said yesterday, this is a respectable community. We have standards." Grace stopped a few feet away, her children clustered behind her. She felt Matthew's anger radiating like heat. She felt Rebecca's tension. She felt Emma's confusion. She kept her face perfectly composed. "I have no quarrel with you, Mrs. Pierce," Grace said quietly. "I'm simply looking for honest work." "Honest work," Mrs. Pierce repeated and laughed. "My dear, your husband stole from dozens of families. Children lost their college funds. Elderly people lost their savings. And you expect us to believe you knew nothing about it?" "I didn't." "So you say? But you lived in the same house. You spent the money he stole. You benefited from his crimes just as surely as if you had committed them yourself." Grace felt something inside her snap. She had endured 2 years of such accusations, 2 years of being blamed for a dead man's sins, 2 years of watching her children suffer for crimes they had not committed. And she was done. She was done apologizing for existing, done accepting judgment from people who knew nothing about her. She took a step forward. "You're right, Mrs. Pierce," Grace said, her voice low and cold. "I lived in the same house as a thief. I was foolish enough to trust a man who lied to me every day. I was naive enough to believe him when he said everything was fine. And when I discovered the truth, when I found him hanging in our cellar, we had a choice." She took another step. "I could have fallen apart. I could have given up. I could have put my children in an orphanage and thrown myself into the river. But I didn't. I sold everything we owned. I paid every debt I could. I worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a scrub woman, anything that would put food in my children's mouths. And when there was no work left in Philadelphia, when creditors were threatening to take my children from me, I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride because it was the only option I had left." Mrs. Pierce's smile had faded. "So you can judge me all you like," Grace continued. "You can whisper behind my back and tell everyone in this town that I'm not fit to work for them. You can make sure my children and I have nowhere to go. But I want you to understand something." She looked the woman directly in the eyes. "I am not ashamed of who I am. I am not ashamed of what I've survived. And I will not let you or anyone else make me feel small." The street had gone silent. A dozen people had stopped to watch the confrontation. Martha Hayes stood in the doorway of her shop, her hand pressed to her mouth. Mrs. Pierce's face had turned red, her composure cracking. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she hissed. "Do you know who I am? My husband owns the bank. He controls half the businesses in this town. One word from me and you'll never find work anywhere in this territory." "Then I suppose I'll have to leave," Grace said calmly, "but I'll do it on my terms, not yours." She turned away, feeling her hands shake, but refusing to let anyone see. She took Rebecca's hand and started walking back toward the boarding house. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Pierce's voice rising in indignation, heard the other women murmuring among themselves. She did not look back. They had walked perhaps 20 feet when a voice called out from across the street, "Mrs. Whitmore!" Grace stopped. The man on the bay horse had returned. He was dismounting now, looping the reins around a hitching post with practiced ease. Up close, she could see his face clearly for the first time. It was weathered, lined by sun and wind, with brown eyes that held no judgment, only assessment. "Yes," Grace said warily. The man crossed the street in 3 long strides. He removed his hat as he approached, a gesture of respect that surprised her. I'm Jacob Brennan, he said. I own the Broken Bee Ranch north of town. I heard you're looking for work. Grace stared at him. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Pierce's sharp intake of breath. I am, Grace said carefully. Jacob Brennan nodded once. Can you cook for a dozen men? Yes. Can you keep accounts, read, write, do arithmetic? I was raised by a mathematics professor, Grace said. I kept books for my father's university department for 5 years. Something flickered in Jacob Brennan's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. Good, he said. I need a cook and bookkeeper. Room and board for you and your children. Wage is $30 a month. The work is hard and the hours are long, but I pay fair and I don't tolerate laziness or theft. Grace felt her heart hammering in her chest. $30 a month was generous. Very generous. Too generous. Why, she asked. You don't know me. Jacob Brennan looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. I know enough, he said. You need work. I need help. That's all the knowing that matters. He glanced past her at the 5 children standing in a line. His gaze lingered on Matthew, who was staring at him with open suspicion, and on Oliver, who clutched Emma's hand and said nothing. There's one condition, Jacob said. You and your family stay out of town gossip. You work hard, keep your head down, and you answer to no one but me. Understood. Grace looked at this stranger who was offering her salvation. She did not understand his motives. She did not understand why he would take such a risk on a woman with a ruined reputation and 5 children to feed. But she had learned not to question good fortune when it appeared. Understood, she said. Wagons around back, Jacob said. We leave in 10 minutes. He replaced his hat and walked away without another word. Grace stood frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Then Rebecca tugged on her sleeve. Mama, is he serious? Rebecca whispered. Is he really going to hire you? Grace looked down at her daughter and saw the hope in her eyes, the desperate, fragile hope that things might finally get better. Yes, Grace said. I think he is. They gathered their belongings from the boarding house. Grace paid Mrs. Patterson for the night's lodging, using the last of her money. Then they followed Jacob Brennan to where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 draft horses. Jacob loaded their trunks into the wagon bed without comment, then helped the children climb up. Grace climbed up last and settled onto the bench seat beside him. He clucked to the horses and the wagon lurched into motion. As they rolled out of town, Grace glanced back once. Mrs. Pierce stood in front of the general store, her face twisted with fury. Martha Hayes stood beside her, and for just a moment their eyes met. Martha raised one hand in a small wave. Grace nodded in return. Then the town disappeared behind a bend in the road, and Grace turned to face forward toward whatever waited ahead. The journey to the Broken Bee Ranch took an hour. They traveled north along a rough dirt road that cut through rolling grassland dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring thaw. The air was clear and cold and smelled of pine and earth. Jacob Brennan did not speak much during the drive. He sat with the reins loose in his hands, his attention on the road and the horses. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to understand this man who had appeared out of nowhere to offer her refuge. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life. There was a stillness about him, a quiet competence that suggested he did not waste energy on unnecessary movement or speech. After 20 minutes of silence, Grace spoke. Mr. Brennan. Jake, he corrected without looking at her. Nobody calls me Mr. on my ranch. Jake, Grace said, may I ask you a question? You can ask, I might not answer. Why did you hire me? You heard what Mrs. Pierce said. You know about my husband. You know people will talk. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Grace thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, people always talk. They talked when I came back from the war. They talked when my wife died. They talked when I built this ranch up from nothing. Talking is what people do when they don't have anything useful to occupy their time. He glanced at her briefly. You stood up to Constance Pierce, he said. Most people in this town are too scared of her husband to do that. Vernon Pierce owns the bank, and he uses that power to control people. Anyone who crosses him ends up in trouble. But you crossed him anyway because you had to, Because you're protecting your children. He turned his attention back to the road. That tells me you're not afraid to do what's necessary, he said. That's the kind of person I want working for me. Grace absorbed this. It was the longest speech she had heard him make, and she sensed it cost him something to say it. Thank you, she said quietly. Jake nodded once. That seemed to be his primary form of communication. Nods, silences, actions instead of words. The children had been quiet during the journey, but now Emma leaned forward from the wagon bed. Mr. Jake, do you have animals on your ranch? Jake glanced back at her, and Grace saw something soften in his expression. Cattle, horses, chickens, he said, and a dog named Duke. Emma's face lit up. Can I pet Duke? If he lets you, he's particular about who he likes. I'm good with animals, Emma said confidently. They always like me. We'll see, Jake said, but there was the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. Matthew, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched, spoke for the first time. How big is your ranch? Jake looked at the boy taking his measure. 800 acres, he said. 300 head of cattle, 12 men on the payroll. It's a good size, but I'm looking to expand. And you need a woman to cook and keep books. Matthew's tone was challenging. Seems like you could hire men to do that. Could, Jake agreed, but your mother's got skills I need, and I don't waste good help when I find it. How do you know she's good help? You haven't seen her cook. You haven't seen her bookkeeping. Grace started to reprimand her son, but Jake spoke first. You're right, he said. I don't know, but I'm willing to take the risk. If she's not good, she won't last. If she is, she'll earn every dollar I pay her. Either way, it's my decision to make, not yours. Matthew flushed but said nothing more. Grace could see the anger in him, the resentment that had been building since Daniel's death. Her son was trying to be the man of the family, and he was failing because he was only 12 years old and should not have to carry that burden. Jake seemed to understand this. He did not press the issue. He simply drove the wagon onward, and eventually Matthew's rigid posture relaxed slightly. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise. Grace's breath caught. It was larger than she had expected. The main house was a two-story wooden structure with a wide porch and real glass windows. Behind it stood a large barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a series of corrals where horses grazed. Beyond that, cattle dotted the landscape as far as she could see. It was not just a ranch. It was an empire. A small one, perhaps, but an empire nonetheless. Jake drove the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. A man emerged from the barn, walking toward them with quick strides. He was perhaps 45, with graying hair and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. Boss Ram, the man said, then stopped when he saw Grace and the children. What's this new cook and bookkeeper? Jake said, climbing down from the wagon. Mrs. Whitmore and her children. This is Ben Tucker, my foreman. Bened Tucker looked at the 5 children, his expression unreadable. Boss, he said carefully, we got a perfectly good cook already. Not anymore, Jake said. Tell Charlie he's back on wrangling duty tomorrow. Ben opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. He nodded once. Yes, sir. You want me to show Mrs. Whitmore where she'll be staying? I'll handle it. Jake helped the children down from the wagon, then offered his hand to Grace. She took it, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, and climbed down. This way, Jake said. He led them through the front door into the house. Inside was warm and clean, but sparse. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a worn sofa, a few chairs, and little else. A staircase led to the second floor. Kitchen's through there, Jake said, pointing. Hands eat at 5:30 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. You'll cook for 12 men plus yourself and your children. If you need supplies, make a list and give it to Ben. He'll get them from town. He started up the stairs, and Grace followed with the children. The second floor had a long hallway with several doors. 4 bedrooms up here, Jake said. Take any 3 you need. Mine's at the end. We don't bother each other. He opened one of the doors to reveal a modest room with 2 beds, a washstand, and a window overlooking the ranch. Clean but simple. Breakfast at 5, Jake said. That gives you 30 minutes to cook. I'll show you the accounts ledger tomorrow. He started to leave, then paused. One more thing, he said. There's a room at the end of the hall. Door's locked. Don't try to open it. Don't ask me about it. It stays locked. Understood. Grace nodded, noting the tension in his voice, the way his jaw had gone tight. Understood. Jake left without another word. Grace heard his boots on the stairs and the front door closing. The children gathered around her in the hallway. Rebecca looked overwhelmed. Matthew looked suspicious. Emma looked excited. Oliver said nothing as always. Lily had fallen asleep against Grace's shoulder. "Is this really happening, Mama?" Rebecca whispered. "Are we really going to stay here?" Grace looked at her daughter and saw the fear beneath the hope. She understood that fear. She felt it too. "Yes," Grace said, "this is really happening." She carried Lily into the bedroom, laid her gently on one of the beds, then gathered the other children close. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "This is our chance, our only chance. We're going to work harder than we've ever worked. We're going to prove we belong here. And we're not going to give anyone a reason to send us away. Do you understand?" Four pairs of eyes looked back at her. Four nods. "Good," echoed Grace said. "Now let's get settled. We have a long day tomorrow." That night, after the children were asleep, Grace lay awake in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, the wind against the windows. She thought about Jacob Brennan in his locked room. She thought about the way he had looked at her children, something unreadable in his eyes. She thought about the offer he had made generous beyond reason and wondered what price she would eventually have to pay for it. But then she thought about her children sleeping soundly for the first time in months, warm and safe and fed. She thought about the $30 a month that would allow them to rebuild their lives. She thought about the possibility that they might finally be able to stop running. And Grace Whitmore allowed herself something she had not allowed in 2 years. She allowed herself to hope. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and dark across the land. In the main house, a single lamp burned in a window on the second floor. Jacob Brennan sat in a chair by that window, looking out at nothing, his weathered hands clasped together. He had not planned to hire anyone today. He had ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. But then he had seen Grace Whitmore standing on the train platform with her children, and something in the set of her shoulders, the way she refused to show defeat even when everything had collapsed around her, had reminded him of someone. His wife, Sarah, standing in the same house 6 years ago, trying to be brave while plague ravaged her body and their sons, trying to stay strong even as the fever climbed higher and higher, calling for him in her delirium, asking when he would come home, not understanding that he was 300 miles away on a cattle drive and would not make it back in time. Jake closed his eyes against the memory. He had locked Thomas's room the day he buried his family. He had not opened it since. Could not bear to see the small bed, the toys, the life that had been stolen. He had hired Grace Whitmore because she needed help, and he had the means to provide it. That was all, nothing more. That was what he told himself. But in the darkness of his room, alone with his ghosts, Jacob Brennan wondered if perhaps he had hired her for another reason. Because he had watched her stand up to Constance Pierce with 5 children behind her and nowhere left to run, and he had seen courage in its purest form. Because he had lost his own family and could not save them, but perhaps he could save this one. Because 6 years was long enough to carry guilt, and perhaps helping someone else carry their burden would ease his own. He did not know. He only knew that tomorrow morning, Grace Whitmore would cook breakfast for 12 men, and if she could do the job, she would stay. And if she stayed, maybe the house would feel a little less empty. Maybe the silence would be a little easier to bear. Jake stood and extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow would come early, as it always did on a ranch. There was no time for dwelling on the past. There was only work day after day until the work was all that remained. He lay down in his bed and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, the house held the sounds of children sleeping. It was not much, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough. Grace woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing. For a moment she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, her body remembering the narrow cot in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, her mind still half caught in dreams of Philadelphia. Then she heard the soft breathing of her daughters in the bed beside hers and remembered. Wyoming. The Broken Bee Ranch. Jacob Brennan. A chance. She rose quickly, careful not to wake Rebecca and Emma. The floorboards were cold beneath her feet. Through the window she could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. 5 o'clock breakfast for 12 hungry ranch hands. She had 30 minutes. Grace dressed in the dark, pinning her hair back, severely rolling up her sleeves. Then she made her way downstairs as quietly as she could, following the smell of old wood smoke toward the kitchen. The kitchen was larger than she had expected, with a massive cast-iron stove, a long wooden table, and shelves stocked with supplies. But it was also filthy. Grease coated the stovetop. Dirty pots were piled in the wash basin. Flour dusted the counters in a way that spoke of carelessness rather than industry. Grace looked at the mess and felt a familiar determination rise in her chest. She lit the stove, heating water while she surveyed the larder. Salt pork potatoes, eggs flour coffee, basic provisions. She could work with this. By the time the sky had turned from black to gray to the deep blue that preceded sunrise, Grace had scrubbed the stovetop, washed the pots, and had biscuits in the oven. She fried salt pork until it was crispy scrambled, 2 dozen eggs with cream, made a pan of gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. The coffee she brewed strong and dark the way her father had taught her men preferred it. She was setting plates on the long table when footsteps sounded on the porch. The door opened and ranch hands began filing in. They stopped when they saw her surprise evident on weathered faces. Grace straightened her spine and met their eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes. Please sit." The men exchanged glances but did as they were told, settling onto benches on either side of the table. Grace recognized Ben Tucker among them. He nodded to her once, his expression carefully neutral. She brought food to the table. Platters of biscuits, bowls of eggs, the pan of fried salt pork, gravy, butter, coffee. The men stared at it. "Well," Grace said, "it won't eat itself." One of the younger hands, perhaps 25, with sandy hair and an eager face, reached for a biscuit. He took a bite, chewed slowly, then looked up at Grace with something like wonder. "Ma'am," he said, "this is the best damn breakfast I've had in 5 years." Several other men nodded agreement, already loading their plates. Grace felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. She had passed the first test. She was pouring coffee when Jacob Brennan entered. He looked the same as yesterday, his clothes worn but clean, his expression unreadable. He took a plate without a word, filled it with food, and ate standing by the window. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye. He ate methodically, without hurry, but without lingering. When he finished, he set his plate in the wash basin and turned to face the room. "Good," he said. His eyes met Grace's for just a moment. "Lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Then he was gone, leaving Grace with 12 men who were now looking at her with considerably more respect than they had when they first walked in. Ben Tucker finished his coffee and stood. "Ma'am," he said, "that was a fine meal. Charlie never cooked like that." "Thank you, Mr. Tucker." "Ben," he corrected, "and I reckon you'll do just fine here." He followed the other men out, leaving Grace alone with the empty plates and the sunrise streaming through the windows. She allowed herself one moment of stillness, one breath of relief. Then she began cleaning up. There was lunch to prepare, and she still had to learn the bookkeeping system. By the time the children woke, Grace had the kitchen spotless and bread dough rising in a covered bowl. Rebecca came down first, her hair braided neatly, her face anxious. "Mama, I heard men's voices. Did you already cook breakfast?" "I did, and they ate it all, which means we did well." Rebecca's face relaxed into something close to a smile. "Can I help with lunch?" "You can, but first let's get your brothers and sisters fed." They made a simple breakfast for the children from the leftovers. Emma chattered excitedly about the ranch, about the horses she had seen through the window, about Duke the dog she hoped to meet. Matthew ate in silence, his young face set in hard lines. Oliver sat close to Emma, eating slowly, saying nothing. After breakfast, Jake appeared at the kitchen door. "Mrs. Whitmore, when you have a moment, I'll show you the accounts." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and followed him to a small room off the main living area. It served as an office with a desk, a few chairs, and shelves lined with ledgers and papers. Jake pulled out a thick, leather-bound book and set it on the desk. "This is the ranch ledger," he said. "Income, expenses, wages, supplies. Everything gets recorded here. Charlie was supposed to keep it current, but he wasn't much good at arithmetic." Grace opened the book and immediately saw the problem. Entries were incomplete. Numbers didn't add up. Whole weeks were missing records entirely. "May I take this with me?" she asked. "I'll need several hours to sort through it properly." "Take as long as you need. Just have it ready for me to review by end of week." Grace nodded, already scanning the columns. Then something caught her eye. She flipped back several pages, checked a date, then flipped forward again. "Jake," she said slowly, "when did Charlie leave?" "Yesterday after I hired you." "Why?" Grace pointed to a line in the ledger. This entry is from 3 days ago. Food supplies purchased from Hayes General Store, $150. Jake leaned over to look. That's high, but we feed a lot of men. Yes, but look at this entry from 2 weeks earlier. Food supplies also $150. And this one from a month before that. Same amount, same store. Jake's expression darkened. 3 months, same amount each time, Grace continued. That's suspicious. Either your men eat exactly the same amount every single month, which is unlikely, or someone is inflating the costs. She pulled out another ledger, this one tracking inventory. Do you keep count of what comes in versus what's actually used? Not closely. Charlie said he did, but I never checked. Grace flipped through pages comparing purchase records to consumption estimates. The discrepancy became clear within minutes. Jake, based on what's recorded here, Charlie claimed to purchase enough food to feed 20 men. You employ 12. Even accounting for waste and seasonal appetites, the numbers don't match. I'd estimate he's been overcharging you by at least $40 a month. Jake's jaw clenched. For how long? Grace checked earlier entries. At least 6 months, possibly longer, but the earlier records are too incomplete to be certain. Jake straightened his hands flat on the desk. $240, he said quietly. Minimum. Grace nodded. She had seen this before. Daniel had done something similar, though, on a much larger scale. Small thefts repeated over time, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. I can document everything, she said, if you need proof for the sheriff. Jake shook his head. Charlie's gone. No point chasing him down over a few $100s. But I want every transaction recorded properly from now on. Every penny accounted for. Can you do that? Yes. Good. He started to leave, then paused. Grace, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Thank you. Most people wouldn't have caught that. I was married to a thief, Jake. I learned to recognize the patterns. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or sympathy. He nodded once and left her to her work. Grace spent the next 2 hours reconstructing the ledger, correcting errors, filling in gaps. It was tedious work, but she had always found comfort in numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't betray you. They simply were waiting to be understood. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't notice the children had gone outside until she heard Emma's delighted laughter through the window. Grace stood and looked out to see her daughter running across the yard, a large brown dog loping beside her. Duke apparently had decided Emma was acceptable. Matthew stood near the barn with Jake, who was showing him how to curry a horse. Grace watched her son's stiff posture gradually relax as Jake demonstrated the proper technique, then handed him the brush. Matthew took it and began working on the horse's coat with fierce concentration. Rebecca had found the chicken coop and was collecting eggs, her basket already half full. Even Oliver had ventured out, though he stayed close to the porch, watching everything with his 2 old eyes. Grace felt something in her chest tighten. Her children looked almost normal, almost happy, as if they were just children living on a ranch, not fugitives from their father's shame. She turned back to the ledger. She would not waste this chance. She would work harder than she had ever worked. She would prove they belonged here. Lunch went as smoothly as breakfast. The men came in hungry and left satisfied. Grace noted with approval that several of them thanked her as they left. Ben Tucker lingered after the others had gone. Ma'am, he said, I owe you an apology. When the boss brought you here yesterday, I thought he'd made a mistake. I was wrong. Thank you, Ben. That means a great deal. He nodded and left. Grace cleaned the kitchen, started preparing dinner, then returned to the ledger. The numbers were beginning to make sense now. The ranch was profitable, but not as profitable as it should be. Charlie's theft was part of the problem, but there were other inefficiencies as well. She made notes as she worked ideas for improvement. She would share them with Jake when she had a complete picture. The afternoon passed quickly. Dinner was beef stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple pie made from dried fruit she found in the larder. The men ate with enthusiasm, and this time several of them complimented her directly. After dinner, Grace put her children to bed early. They were exhausted from the day's excitement. She tucked Lily in first, then Emma, then checked on the boys. Matthew was already asleep, his face relaxed in a way it never was during waking hours. Oliver lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Grace sat on the edge of his bed. Are you all right, sweetheart? Oliver looked at her but said nothing. He hadn't spoken a complete sentence since the day they found Daniel. The doctors in Philadelphia had said it was shocked that he might speak again when he felt safe. Grace hoped they were right. She kissed his forehead and left him to sleep. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Grace made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger working by lamplight. She was so absorbed in the numbers that she didn't hear Jake enter until he spoke. "You're still working." Grace looked up startled. Jake stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Just finishing up. I wanted to have this ready for you." He crossed to the table and sat down across from her, studying the ledger. She turned toward him. Grace had reorganized everything, color-coding entries, adding summaries, projecting income and expenses for the next quarter. Jake read in silence for several minutes. Then he looked up at her. "This is impressive work. Thank you. You did this all in one day." The foundation was there. It just needed organization. Jake turned a few more pages, his expression thoughtful. "You've made recommendations here about grain purchases, about rotating grazing areas. Where did you learn ranch management?" "I didn't, but I understand economics, and these changes would save you approximately $200 a year without reducing quality." Jake closed the ledger carefully. "Hire you as a cook, get an accountant and business advisor for free," he said. "I made a good deal. You gave me and my children a home when no one else would. I'd say we both made a good deal." They sat in silence for a moment. The lamplight cast shadows across Jake's weathered face, making him look older and somehow more vulnerable than he did in daylight. "May I ask you something?" Grace said. "You can ask. Why did you really hire me, the truth, not the version you told me on the wagon?" Jake was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. "I had a wife," he said, "Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He was 3 years old when the plague came through. It was bad that year, killed a dozen people in Silver Creek alone." Grace waited, sensing he needed to tell this at his own pace. "I was on a cattle drive in Montana," Jake continued, 3 months away. Sarah was here alone with Thomas. When the fever started, Doc Warren did everything he could, but there wasn't much anyone could do against plague. They both died within a week of each other. His voice was flat and emotionless, but Grace could hear the pain underneath. "I got home 2 weeks after they were buried," Jake said. "Doc Warren told me Sarah called for me every day, asked when I was coming home. She died still asking." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I should have been here. I chose money over family, and I lost them both." He turned to face her. "Yesterday, when I saw you standing in front of that store with your children, with Constance Pierce trying to break you, I saw someone who refused to abandon their family no matter what it cost. And I thought maybe if I'd had a wife like that, someone who would fight that hard, maybe things would have turned out different." "You couldn't have known," Grace said softly. "Doesn't change the fact that I wasn't there." He moved back to the table but didn't sit. "I hired you because you needed help, and I could provide it," he said. "But also because this house has been empty too long. Because I'm tired of the silence. Because maybe helping your family will make up for failing my own." Grace stood and placed a hand on his arm. The contact seemed to surprise him. "You didn't fail them, Jake. Life failed them. Disease failed them. But you loved them, and that matters." Jake looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For a moment, something passed between them. Understanding. Recognition. Two people who had both lost everything and were trying to build something new from the ruins. Then the moment passed. Jake stepped back and Grace lowered her hand. "It's late," he said. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's another full day." "Yes, good night, Jake." "Good night, Grace." She climbed the stairs to her room, but before she went in, she glanced down the hallway at the locked door. Thomas's room. A shrine to a little boy who had died calling for his father. Grace understood now why Jake could not open that door. Some grief was too large to face all at once. You had to approach it sideways in small pieces when you had the strength. She went to bed but lay awake for a long time thinking about Jake Brennan and his ghosts, about her own ghosts, about the strange mercy of two broken people finding each other in the wilderness of their losses. That night, while Grace slept, a storm rolled in from the north. She woke to the sound of wind howling against the windows and something else, something that made her blood run cold. Lily was crying, not the normal fussy cry of a tired toddler, but a high keening wail that spoke of pain. Grace was out of bed in an instant, racing across the hall to where Rebecca and the younger children slept. She found Lily sitting up in bed, her small face flushed red, her body trembling. Grace pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead and felt her heart drop. The child was burning with fever. "Rebecca," Grace said urgently, "get me cool water and clean cloths. Now!" Rebecca scrambled out of bed and ran downstairs. Grace picked up Lily, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her small body. The toddler's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps. Grace had seen this before, in Philadelphia before they left. Lily had been sick then, a chest infection, the doctor said, but it had cleared up after a week of medicine. Or so Grace had thought. "Mama," Lily whimpered, "hurts." "I know, baby, I know. Mama's going to make it better." But Grace didn't know if she could, not without a doctor, not without medicine. And outside, the storm was building into something fierce. Rebecca returned with water and cloths. Grace began sponging Lily's face and arms, trying to bring the fever down, but the child's temperature kept climbing. Within minutes, Lily had stopped responding to Grace's voice. Her eyes rolled back, her body went rigid. She was convulsing. Grace screamed for Jake. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, pulling on his shirt, his hair disheveled from sleep. He took one look at Lily and his face went hard. "How long has she been like this?" "10 minutes, maybe less. Jake, she's burning up. I can't get the fever down." Jake moved to the window, looked out at the storm. Snow was falling, so thick Grace couldn't see past the porch. The wind had picked up to a howl that rattled the glass. "We need Doc Warren," Jake said. "He's in Silver Creek, 4 miles. "You can't ride in this," Grace said, her voice breaking. "You'll die out there." Jake looked at her, then at Lily, then back at Grace. "She'll die here," he said quietly. "At least out there, I have a chance of saving her." He left the room. Grace heard him moving through the house, heard him talking to Ben Tucker, who must have been woken by the commotion. When Jake returned, he was dressed for the storm, layers of heavy clothes, a thick coat, gloves, a scarf wrapped around his face. "Keep sponging her with cool water," he said. "If she starts convulsing again, hold her so she doesn't hurt herself, but don't try to stop it. Just keep her safe until I get back." "Jake." "I'll be back. Grace, I promise." He was gone before she could say anything else. Grace heard the front door open, heard the roar of the storm rush in, then the door slamming shut. And then there was only the wind and Lily's labored breathing and Grace's prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Rebecca stood in the corner holding Emma, who had woken and was crying. Matthew appeared in the doorway, his young face tight with fear. "Is Lily going to die?" he asked. Grace looked at her son, at the terror in his eyes, and felt something break inside her chest. She had lost Daniel. She had lost her home, her reputation, everything she had built. But she could not lose Lily. She would not survive it. "No," Grace said, her voice fierce. "No, she's not going to die, Mr. Brennan is bringing the doctor. Everything is going to be fine." She said it with such conviction that Matthew nodded, though his hands were shaking. She said it with such force that Rebecca stopped crying and came to help with the cool cloths. She said it with such certainty that even she almost believed it. But in her heart, Grace was terrified. Because outside, a man was riding into a killing storm for a child who was not his, for a family he had known less than 2 days. And Grace did not know if even Jacob Brennan was strong enough to survive what the Wyoming night had become. The hours that followed were the longest of Grace's life. She held Lily, sponged her burning skin, whispered desperate prayers and lullabies. The fever climbed higher. At one point, Lily convulsed again, her small body going rigid in Grace's arms, and Grace held her daughter and sobbed because she could do nothing else. Rebecca and Matthew took turns keeping watch at the window, looking for any sign of Jake's return. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow piled against the windows. The wind screamed like something alive and angry. Dawn came gray and terrible. The storm had not abated. Grace's arms ached from holding Lily. Her voice was hoarse from singing. And still there was no sign of Jake. "He's not coming back," Matthew said, his voice dull. "Nobody could survive out there." "He's coming back," Grace said. "He promised." But with each passing minute, Grace's faith wavered. How could anyone survive 4 miles in that storm? How could anyone even find their way? Jake had ridden out into certain death, and it was Grace's fault. Her child, her need, his sacrifice. If he died out there, she would never forgive herself. Then just as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting weak light across the snow-covered landscape, they heard it. Hoofbeats. Rebecca ran to the window. "It's him. Mama, it's Mr. Jake." Grace didn't move. She couldn't. She held Lily and waited, barely breathing, as the front door opened and Jake stumbled inside. He was covered in ice. His beard was white with frozen breath. His movements were stiff, jerky, the movements of someone pushed far past the limits of endurance. But behind him came an older man carrying a leather medical bag. Doc Warren. The doctor moved to Grace without a word, already reaching for Lily. He pressed his ear to her chest, lifted her eyelids, felt her pulse. "Pneumonia," he said grimly. "And the fever's taken hold hard. How long has she been like this?" 6 hours, Grace whispered. 6 hours in a child this age is a lifetime. "I'll do what I can, but you need to prepare yourself, Mrs. Whitmore. She might not make it." "She'll make it," Grace said. "She has to." Doc Warren opened his bag and began working. He gave Lily medicine, placed cold compresses on her head and chest, listened to her breathing with growing concern. Jake stood in the corner, dripping melted snow onto the floor, his face gray with exhaustion. "Jake," Grace said softly, "you need to get warm. You need to change." "I'm fine." "You're half frozen." "I said I'm fine." But he wasn't. Grace could see the way his hands shook, the way he swayed slightly on his feet. Ben Tucker appeared and tried to lead Jake away to change into dry clothes, but Jake refused to move. He stood watch over Lily as if his presence alone could will her to survive. An hour passed. 2. Doc Warren worked steadily, checking Lily's breathing, administering more medicine, monitoring her fever. Slowly, so slowly, Grace almost didn't dare hope the fever began to drop. 3 degrees. 5. 7. Lily's breathing eased. Her color improved from flushed red to merely pale. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "Mama," she whispered. Grace sobbed and pulled her daughter close. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're going to be fine." Doc Warren sat back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She's through the worst of it," he said. "The medicine's working. She'll need rest and careful monitoring for the next few days, but she should recover fully." Grace looked up at Jake, who was still standing in the corner. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Grace saw the truth written plainly on his face. He had not ridden into that storm as her employer performing a duty. He had ridden into it as something more. Something neither of them was ready to name yet, but something real nonetheless. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "Jake, thank you." He nodded once, then finally allowed Ben to lead him away to change and warm up. Doc Warren stayed for another 2 hours, making sure Lily was stable. When he finally left, promising to return the next day to check on her, Grace was alone with her sleeping daughter and her own overwhelming gratitude. Jake had risked his life to save Lily. He had ridden through a storm that could have killed him for a child he barely knew, for a woman he had hired only yesterday. And he had done it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. Grace did not understand it, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she owed Jacob Brennan a debt she could never fully repay. More than that, she realized something else. She trusted him. Completely. Utterly. In a way she had not trusted anyone since Daniel died. And that, more than anything else that had happened in the past 2 days, terrified her. Because trust was dangerous. Trust opened you up to hurt. Trust meant giving someone the power to destroy you. But as Grace sat holding her sleeping daughter, listening to the sounds of the house around her, feeling safe for the first time in 2 years, she made a choice. She chose to trust Jacob Brennan, whatever that might cost her. 2 weeks passed in relative peace. Lily recovered fully, her laughter once again filling the ranch house. The children settled into routines. Matthew spent every spare moment with Jake, learning the ways of the ranch, with a hunger that spoke of his desperate need for a father figure. Emma had indeed won over Duke, and the dog now slept at the foot of her bed each night. Rebecca proved herself invaluable in the kitchen, her capable hands making Grace's work easier. Even Oliver seemed more at ease, though he still did not speak. Grace worked harder than she had ever worked. She rose before dawn, cooked 3 meals a day for 15 people, kept the accounts meticulously, and managed to make the ranch house feel like a home rather than just a place where men slept and ate. Jake noticed. He said little as was his nature, but Grace saw it in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, in the way he made sure she had everything she needed before she had to ask for it, in the small gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. On Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the storm that had nearly taken Lily, Grace prepared the children for church once more. Jake did not offer to accompany them, though Ben Tucker would drive them again in the wagon. This time Grace dressed with determination rather than anxiety. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She had survived worse than small-town gossip. The sanctuary fell silent when they entered, just as it had before. But this time when Grace chose a pew, Martha Hayes rose from her seat and came to sit beside her. "Mind if I join you?" Martha asked. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness. "I'd be honored." They sat together, Martha's solid presence, a shield against the hostile stares. The service proceeded, and this time Grace could focus on the Reverend's words about redemption and grace without the constant weight of judgment pressing down on her. After the service, Constance Pierce was waiting outside with her usual retinue of women. Grace braced herself for another confrontation, but before Constance could speak, Martha stepped forward. "Constance," Martha said pleasantly, "I was just telling Mrs. Whitmore about the Ladies' Aid Society meeting next week. I do hope she'll join us." Constance's face darkened. "Martha, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Martha said firmly. "I'm inviting her, as I would invite any respectable woman in this town." Grace could see the calculation in Constance's eyes. Martha Hayes owned the most successful business in Silver Creek outside of the bank. She was well-liked and respected. Crossing her openly would cost Constance social capital she could not afford to lose. "Of course," Constance said, her smile tight. "Any respectable woman is welcome, though I'm not sure Mrs. Whitmore will have time given her living arrangements." "My living arrangements are perfectly proper," Grace said calmly. "I am employed as a cook and bookkeeper. I have separate quarters, and I work harder than most people in this town have ever worked in their lives." She met Constance's eyes directly. "If you have concerns about my morality, Mrs. Pierce, perhaps you should examine your own. I've heard stories about how your husband conducts business at the bank, about families forced to sell their property at unfair prices, about loans called in without proper cause. That seems far more scandalous than a widow trying to feed her children." The crowd that had gathered went very still. No one spoke to Constance Pierce that way. No one dared. Constance's face turned white, then red. "How dare you?" she hissed. "My husband is a respected businessman." "Your husband is a bully," Grace said quietly, "and bullies only have power as long as people are too afraid to stand up to them." She gathered her children and walked away, her heart pounding, but her head held high. Behind her she heard murmurs spreading through the crowd, some disapproving, but some Grace was surprised to hear sounded approving. In the wagon on the way back to the ranch, Matthew looked at his mother with something like wonder. "You're not scared of anyone, are you, Mama?" Grace thought about that, about Daniel's body in the cellar, about standing on a train platform with nothing but children and shame, about watching Lily burn with fever while Jake rode into a storm, about all the moments in her life when she had been absolutely terrified. "I'm scared of lots of things," she said honestly, "but I've learned that being scared doesn't mean you stop fighting." When they returned to the ranch, they found Jake and Ben in the barn looking grim. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. Jake held up a piece of paper. "This was nailed to the barn door while we were gone." Grace took it. The message was written in crude block letters. "Whore, leave or die." Grace felt ice form in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "When did this appear?" "Sometime in the last hour," Ben said. "Must have been while we were all at church or in town. Coward did it when he knew no one was here." Jake's face was like stone. "I'm moving you and the children into the main house," he said. "Tonight. The guest rooms upstairs aren't safe enough if someone's willing to threaten violence." "Jake, I can't." "You can and you will, Medney," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "Whoever did this knows where you sleep. They know the layout of the house. Until we know who we're dealing with and what they're planning. You and your children stay where I can protect you." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the careful distance she had kept between them, But she looked at the threatening note, thought about her children sleeping in those isolated guest rooms, and knew Jake was right. All right, she said. Thank you. That night, Grace and the children moved into the main part of the house. Jake gave up his own bedroom, the largest for Grace and the girls. Matthew bunked with Ivor in what had been a storage room. Jake moved his things into the small study downstairs. This is temporary, he assured Grace, just until we know you're safe. But as Grace lay in Jake's bed that night, surrounded by his things, breathing in the scent of leather and pine that clung to everything he owned, she wondered if anything about this arrangement was truly temporary anymore. Over the next few days, Jake doubled the watch on the ranch. Ranch hands took turns patrolling at night. Ben Tucker personally inspected every fence line, every building, looking for signs of sabotage or further threats. Grace tried to continue her work as normal, but she could feel the tension building. The note had changed something. What had been uncomfortable but manageable had become dangerous. She was kneading bread dough one afternoon when Ben Tucker came into the kitchen, his face troubled. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something. Something about Vernon Pierce and the boss that you should know." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm listening." Ben glanced around, making sure they were alone. 6 years ago, before Mr. Brennan bought this land, Pierce tried to buy it himself. The previous owner, old man Garrett, refused to sell. He sold to Mr. Brennan instead day before he died. Some folks say Garrett's death wasn't as natural as Doc Warren claimed. Grace felt her blood run cold. "You're saying Pierce killed him?" "I'm saying there are questions nobody wanted to ask. Garrett was healthy as a horse one day, dead the next. Doc Warren called it heart failure, but—" Ben trailed off. "Pierce wanted this land bad back then, and he wants it bad now. And he's shown he doesn't care who he has to destroy to get it. Does Jake know this?" "He suspects, but there's no proof, never was. But you need to understand, ma'am, Pierce isn't just a banker trying to foreclose on a loan. He's a dangerous man who's willing to do whatever it takes. And you standing up to his wife at church, that made you a target too." After Ben left, Grace stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking. She had known Pierce was powerful and vindictive, but she hadn't understood the depth of his cruelty until now. That evening after dinner, Jake called a meeting in the main house. All the ranch hands gathered along with Grace and the older children. "I'm going to be direct," Jake said. "Someone is targeting this ranch. Someone threatened Mrs. Whitmore and her children. We don't know who, but we can guess why. Vernon Pierce wants this land, and he's willing to use any means to get it." He looked around the room. "I'm not asking any of you to stay. If you want to leave, find work somewhere safer, I understand. No hard feelings. But if you stay, you need to know what we're up against." One of the younger hands, the one who had complimented Grace's cooking that first morning, spoke up. "Boss, we're not going anywhere. You've treated us fair, paid us well. If Pierce wants trouble, he'll get it." The other men nodded in agreement. Ben Tucker stepped forward. "Boss, I've been with you since you bought this place. Watched you build it from nothing. Pierce isn't taking it without a fight." Jake's expression softened slightly. "All right then. We double our vigilance. Nobody goes anywhere alone. We watch each other's backs. And if anyone sees anything suspicious, anything at all, you report it immediately." The men dispersed to their duties. Grace found herself alone with Jake in the main room. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "Take on Pierce for me. Risk everything you've built." Jake looked at her steadily. "Grace, the moment I hired you, this became my fight as much as yours. Maybe more. Because Pierce doesn't just want you gone. He wants this ranch, and he's using you as an excuse to come after it. So we fight him together, or we both lose everything." He paused. "Besides, I made you a promise. The night of the storm, when I rode out to save Lily, I promised I'd come back, and I keep my promises, Grace. All of them." Grace felt something shift in her chest, something warm and frightening and inevitable. "Jake, I need to tell you something," she said. "I've been thinking a lot these past 2 weeks. About what you did for Lily. About what you're doing for all of us. About the risk you're taking." She took a breath. "I came here expecting to work to earn my keep, to keep my distance. I told myself this was just a job that I wouldn't get attached, wouldn't let myself care. But I can't do that anymore. I can't pretend I don't see how good you are with my children, how patient you are with Matthew, How you carried Oliver to bed when he had that nightmare. How you let Emma's dog sleep in your barn, even though you said animals don't belong in the house. Grace moved closer. I can't pretend I don't see the kind of man you are, Jake Brennan. And I can't pretend I don't. She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Don't what? Jake asked softly. Care about you, Grace whispered. More than I should, more than is safe. Jake reached out and took her hand. Grace, I rode into that storm knowing I might die. I did it because the thought of your little girl dying when I could save her was unbearable. I did it because somewhere in the last 2 days your family had become important to me. More important than my own safety. He squeezed her hand. So if you care about me, that's all right. Because I care about you too, more than I've cared about anyone in 6 years. And it scares the hell out of me, but I'm done running from it. Grace looked up at him, at this strong, quiet man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her family, who had given them shelter and safety and something that felt dangerously close to love. I'm done running too, she said. They stood there in the lamplight, hands clasped, and Grace knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee. They were no longer two strangers helping each other survive. They were something more, something that would change everything. The next morning, Grace woke to find a letter had been slipped under the front door during the night. Jake found it first. His face was grim when he brought it to Grace. It's addressed to you. Grace opened it with shaking hands. The message inside was typed neatly, professional looking. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you have fallen on difficult times. However, your presence in Silver Creek has become problematic. You are encouraging others to question legitimate business practices and spreading malicious gossip about respectable citizens. I am prepared to offer you $500 to leave Wyoming Territory with your children. This is more than generous compensation for any inconvenience. If you choose not to accept this offer, I cannot be responsible for what might happen to you or your employer. Accidents happen frequently on ranches. It would be a shame if Mr. Brennan or one of your children were hurt due to your poor judgment. You have 1 week to decide. Veep, Grace read the letter twice, feeling rage build in her chest. He's threatening my children, she said, her voice shaking. He's threatening you, and he thinks I'll just take his money and run. Jake took the letter, read it, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. We're taking this to the sheriff. The sheriff can't do anything. Pierce owns half the town. Maybe, but we're going to create a paper trail. Every threat, every incident, everything documented. Because when we finally bring Pierce down, I want evidence that can't be disputed. They rode into town that afternoon, leaving the children with Ben Tucker and strict orders not to leave the house. Sheriff Tom Clayton listened to their story, examined the letter, and looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you, I do. But without proof that Pierce actually wrote this, without witnesses to the threats, there's not much I can do. You can file a report, Jake said. Put it on record that we came to you. I can do that, but I'll be honest with you. Pierce has powerful friends, the territorial governor, judges, other bankers. If this goes to court, it's your word against his. Then we make sure it never goes to court, Grace said. We make this public. Let the whole town know what kind of man he is. Clayton shook his head. That could backfire. Pierce could sue you for slander, ruin you financially even if you win the ranch. They left the sheriff's office with nothing but a filed report and a growing sense of helplessness. Pierce had trapped them neatly. Fight back and risk everything. Run and lose everything. There was no good option. On the ride back to the ranch, Jake was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. There's going to be a town council meeting next week. Pierce called it. He's planning something big. How do you know? Ben heard it from one of the men who works at the bank. Pierce wants to discuss community standards and the moral character of local businesses. He's going to come after me publicly, Grace. Try to force me out by destroying my reputation. Then we fight back publicly. Grace, no, she said firmly. I've been running for 2 years, running from Daniel's shame, running from judgment, running from everything. I'm done. If Pierce wants a public fight, we'll give him one. And we'll make sure everyone in that town sees exactly what kind of man he is. Jake looked at her and something like pride crossed his face. All right, he said. Then we'd better prepare. Because if we're going to take on Vernon Pierce in front of the whole town, we need to be ready for anything. The week that followed was tense. Grace and Jake worked late into the night going through every document related to the ranch, every loan payment, every business transaction. They were looking for ammunition, anything that could prove Pierce's fraud or malicious intent. What they found was worse than they expected. Pierce hadn't just targeted the Broken Bee Ranch. Over the past 5 years, he had systematically called in loans, foreclosed on properties, and forced at least a dozen families to sell at below market prices. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for, and Grace, with her father's training in law and her own bitter experience with financial fraud, knew exactly what to look for. This is criminal, she said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. This is conspiracy, fraud, extortion. Pierce has been running a scheme to monopolize land along the creek for years. Can we prove it? Jake asked. Maybe, if we can get the other families to testify, if we can show the pattern. If a judge is willing to listen. That's a lot of ifs. It is, but it's more than we had yesterday. The night before the town council meeting, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in Jake's bed, staring at the ceiling, running through everything she wanted to say. Every argument, every piece of evidence, every reason why Vernon Pierce should be the one run out of town, not her. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock on the door. Grace, you awake? Jake's voice quiet so as not to wake the children. Yes. He opened the door, silhouetted in the lamplight from downstairs. Can't sleep either, he said. Thought you might want company. Grace sat up. Come in. Jake entered, careful to leave the door open for propriety's sake. He sat in the chair by the window, and they talked in low voices about the morning, about what might happen, about all the ways things could go wrong. What if they don't believe us? Grace asked. What if Pierce is too powerful? Then we tried, Jake said, and we tried together. That counts for something. Does it? If we lose the ranch, if I have to take my children and leave? You won't be alone, Jake interrupted. If we lose the ranch, we leave together. You and me and all the children. We'll start over somewhere else. Grace looked at him in surprise. Jake, you have spent years building this place. You can't just walk away from it. Watch me, he said simply. This ranch is just land and buildings, Grace. It's not worth more than you and your family. If I have to choose between keeping the property and keeping you, there's no choice at all. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. You'd do that? Give up everything you've built? I already gave up everything once when Sarah and Thomas died. It nearly destroyed me. But you know what I learned? The things that matter aren't the things you can build or buy. They're the people you love. And Grace, He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I love you, he said finally. I love your children. I love the way you fight for them. I love your stubbornness and your strength and the way you get up every time life knocks you down. So yes, I'd give up the ranch. I'd give up anything, as long as you and your family are safe. Grace crossed the room and took his hands in hers. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I do. Jake stood and pulled her close, and they held each other in the darkness, drawing strength from each other for whatever tomorrow might bring. The town council meeting was held in the largest room of the Silver Creek Town Hall. By 6 o'clock, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread that something significant was happening, and the entire town had turned out to watch. Vernon Pierce sat at the head table with 2 other council members, looking confident and calm. Constance Pierce sat in the front row, her expression smug. They thought they had already won. Grace and Jake entered together and the room fell silent. Grace wore her best dress, her hair pinned back severely. She carried a leather folder containing all the documents they had gathered. Jake wore his only suit, looking uncomfortable but determined. They took seats in the front row, directly across from the Pierces. Vernon Pierce called the meeting to order, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Thank you all for coming, he said. I've called this meeting to discuss a matter of great concern to our community, the moral standards by which we conduct business and maintain our reputations. He looked directly at Grace. Recently, we have seen certain individuals come to our town and attempt to ingratiate themselves through deception. We have seen questions raised about the character of our most respected citizens. We have seen efforts to undermine the very institutions that keep this community strong. Grace felt Jake tense beside her, but she placed a hand on his arm. Not yet. Let Pierce finish digging his own grave. Pierce continued warming to his subject. It has come to my attention that Jacob Brennan, who owes a substantial sum to Silver Creek Bank, has entered into an inappropriate living arrangement with a woman of questionable background. This woman, Mrs. Whitmore, is the widow of a criminal. She came to our town under false pretenses, deceived a local rancher into hiring her, and has now taken up residence in his home with 5 children in tow. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. As president of Silver Creek Bank and a member of this council, I must ask, is this the kind of behavior we want to encourage in our community? Should we not hold our business owners to higher standards? Pierce pulled out papers from his own folder. Furthermore, I have evidence that Mr. Brennan has been mismanaging his ranch, failing to meet financial obligations, and engaging in reckless business practices. As such, the bank has no choice but to call in his outstanding loan of $2,000 due within 30 days. The room erupted. Jake half rose from his seat, but Grace pulled him back down. Not yet, she whispered. Let me. She stood and the room fell silent. Mr. Pierce, Grace said, her voice clear and carrying, may I address the council? Pierce's smile tightened. This is a council meeting, Mrs. Whitmore, not a public forum. Then I address the citizens of Silver Creek, Grace said, turning to face the crowd, because they deserve to know the truth. She opened her folder. My name is Grace Whitmore. As Mr. Pierce correctly stated, I am the widow of Daniel Whitmore, who embezzled money from his clients and took his own life rather than face trial. I had no knowledge of his crime. I paid every debt I could from the sale of our possessions. And when there was nothing left, I came west to start over. She met Pierce's eyes. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. When that arrangement fell through, I found myself stranded in Silver Creek with 5 children and less than $2 to my name. Jacob Brennan hired me as a cook and bookkeeper. Nothing more, nothing less. I live in separate quarters. I work harder than any employee he has ever had, and I have done absolutely nothing to warrant the harassment and threats I have received. She held up papers. Mr. Pierce claims my employer is mismanaging his finances. Let me show you the truth. Grace began laying out documents on a table at the front of the room. These are the ranch accounts as I found them 2 weeks ago. Incomplete, riddled with errors. Evidence of systematic theft by the previous cook, who had been overcharging for supplies and pocketing the difference. I documented every discrepancy. I reorganized the entire system. And I made recommendations that have already increased the ranch's profitability by 15%. She pulled out more papers. Mr. Pierce claims Mr. Brennan is behind on loan payments. Here are the bank's own receipts showing every payment made on time in full with interest. There has never been a missed payment, not once. Vernon Pierce's face was turning red. Mrs. Whitmore, you have no authority. I have documentation, Grace said firmly, which is more than you have. You claim Mr. Brennan violated loan terms by hiring me. Let me read you Section 4, Paragraph C of the loan agreement. She held up the document. Significant operational changes require notification to the lender. Such changes are defined as those affecting land management, livestock operations, or capital assets exceeding $500. Hiring a cook does not meet this definition. Furthermore, the bank accepted 2 monthly payments after I was employed without any objection. By accepting those payments, you waived any right to claim breach of contract. Samuel Cross, the town's elderly lawyer, stood up from his seat. She's correct, Vernon. You can't call in the loan on those grounds. Pierce stood, his composure finally cracking. This is outrageous. This woman has no legal standing. I have every right to defend my employer, Grace said, and I have every right to defend myself against your harassment. She pulled out the threatening letter. This letter was delivered to the ranch 1 week ago. It threatened me and my children. It threatened Mr. Brennan. It offered me money to leave town and implied that violence would follow if I refused. She held it up for the crowd to see. The letter is signed with initials VP. Now, I can't prove Vernon Pierce wrote it, but I find the coincidence interesting. The crowd was murmuring loudly now. Martha Hayes stood up. Vernon, is this true? Did you threaten Mrs. Whitmore? Of course not, Pierce sputtered. This is clearly a fabrication. It's not a fabrication, Jake said, standing. I was there when we found it, and it's not the only incident. Someone nailed a threatening note to our barn door 2 weeks ago. Someone has been watching the ranch. And Ben Tucker found evidence that our fence line was cut deliberately 3 nights ago. Grace wasn't finished. But let's talk about the real issue here, she said. Mr. Pierce claims to be concerned about moral standards and business practices. Let me show you what his business practices actually look like. She spread out the documents they had gathered over the past week. In the last 5 years, Silver Creek Bank has foreclosed on or forced the sale of 12 properties along the creek. In every single case, the loans were called in using dubious legal justifications. In every case, the properties were sold for far below market value. And in every case, those properties were either purchased by Mr. Pierce directly or by business associates of Mr. Pierce. She pointed to the map she had created, showing the pattern of acquisitions. This isn't banking. This is a systematic scheme to monopolize water rights and land ownership in this valley. Mr. Pierce has been using his position at the bank to target anyone who won't sell to him willingly. Vernon Pierce's face had gone from red to white. Constance Pierce looked stricken. These are slanderous accusations, Pierce said, his voice shaking. I will sue you for every penny. Sue me, Grace said calmly. I have nothing left to take. But while you're at it, you might want to explain to the Territorial Banking Commission why your practices fit the exact definition of fraud, extortion, and abuse of fiduciary duty. She held up one more paper. I've already filed a formal complaint with the commission in Cheyenne. An investigator will arrive next week to audit the bank's records. Every transaction, every loan, every foreclosure, all of it. The room erupted. People were standing, shouting, demanding answers. Grace saw several men she recognized from the list of families Pierce had targeted. They were angry. They wanted justice. Reverend Thomas stood and raised his hands for quiet. Vernon, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. These are serious accusations. Do you have any response? Pierce looked around the room at the hostile faces, at the evidence spread out on the table, at his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. This meeting is adjourned, he said abruptly, and tried to leave. But the crowd blocked his path. Men he had cheated, families he had threatened, people who had been too afraid to stand up to him until now. You owe me an explanation, one man shouted. You foreclosed on my father's ranch 5 years ago, said he was behind on payments when he wasn't. You tried to buy my land for half what it's worth, another called out. More voices joined in a chorus of grievances that had been building for years. Pierce pushed through the crowd, Constance hurrying after him. They fled the town hall like criminals, and no one tried to stop them. After they left, the crowd turned to Grace. She felt dozens of eyes on her, but this time they weren't hostile. They were curious, grateful, respectful. Martha Hayes came forward first. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for having the courage to speak up when the rest of us were too afraid. Others came forward to shake Grace's hand, to thank her, to share their own stories of Pierce's abuses. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Grace felt like she might actually belong. Jake stood beside her through it all, his hand on the small of her back, steady and supportive. When they finally left the town hall 2 hours later, the moon was high and the street was empty. You were magnificent, Jake said as they climbed into the wagon. I've never seen anything like that. You destroyed him, Grace. Destroyed him with facts and logic and courage. We destroyed him, Grace corrected, together. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence. When they arrived, Ben Tucker was waiting on the porch with a rifle across his lap. All quiet here, he reported. Kids are all asleep, no trouble. There won't be any more trouble, Jake said. Pierce is finished. But he was wrong. 3 days later, Grace woke to the sound of shouting and the smell of smoke. She threw on her robe and ran to the window. Orange light flickered in the darkness. The barn was on fire. Grace's heart stopped. Not the barn where Jake kept his horses. Not the barn where Matthew spent every spare moment. Not the place that represented everything Jake had built. She ran downstairs screaming for Jake. He was already outside in his nightshirt organizing a bucket line from the well. Ranch hands were running with water, but the fire was spreading too fast, too hot. The horses, someone shouted. They're still in there? Jake and Ben ran toward the barn entrance. Grace saw Matthew break away from where the children were huddled on the porch and run toward the barn too. Matthew, no, Grace screamed. But her son didn't listen. He disappeared into the smoke. Grace ran after him, her mind blank with terror. She couldn't lose Matthew. She couldn't lose Jake. She couldn't lose everything they had built. The smoke inside the barn was suffocating. Grace could barely see. She called for Matthew, coughing, her eyes streaming. She heard horses screaming, heard men shouting, heard the crack of burning wood above her. Then she heard a sound that turned her blood to ice, a beam breaking, falling. Grace looked up and saw it coming down straight toward where a small figure stood frozen with fear. Matthew. She screamed his name and ran, but she was too far away. She watched in horror as the beam fell. Then Jake appeared out of the smoke, tackling Matthew and rolling them both out of the way. The beam crashed down where they had been standing, sending up a shower of sparks. But Jake didn't get up. Grace reached them and fell to her knees. The beam had clipped Jake's shoulder as he rolled. Blood was spreading across his nightshirt. Matthew was beneath him, crying but unharmed. "Help!" Grace screamed. "Someone help us!" Ben and two other hands appeared. They lifted Jake carefully, carrying him out of the barn. Grace held Matthew's hand and pulled him along, both of them coughing violently. Outside, they laid Jake on the ground. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The wound on his shoulder was deep and bleeding freely. Doc Warren was sent for immediately. Grace pressed her hands against Jake's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Matthew stood beside her, tears streaming down his face. "It's my fault," Matthew sobbed. "I wanted to save the horses. I went in, and Mr. Jake came after me, and it's my fault he's hurt." "Hush," Grace said, her voice breaking. "This is not your fault. Mr. Jake made a choice. He chose to save you." Jake's eyes fluttered open. "Matthew," he murmured. "I'm here, Mr. Jake. I'm okay." "Good." Jake's eyes found Grace. "The horses. Ben got them all out. Everyone's safe except you, you stubborn, reckless, wonderful man." Jake tried to smile, then winced. "Worth it," he said. "He's your son." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "You can't die on me, Jake Brennan. I just told you I love you. You don't get to leave now." "Not planning on it," Jake said. Then his eyes closed again as Doc Warren arrived. The barn was lost, but the house and other buildings had been saved. As dawn broke, they could see the full extent of the damage. The barn was a smoking ruin, but all the horses had been saved. All the people were safe. And near the back of what remained of the barn, Ben Tucker found evidence that would change everything. A can of kerosene and a monogram embossed on the side. V.P. Vernon Pierce had set the fire. The sheriff arrested Pierce that same morning. With physical evidence linking him to arson, with the Banking Commission investigation already underway, with half the town now willing to testify against him, Pierce's empire collapsed in a matter of hours. He tried to run, taking as much money as he could from the bank. But the territorial marshal caught him 50 miles outside of Cheyenne. He was brought back in chains to stand trial. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Vernon Pierce was convicted of fraud, extortion, and arson. He was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. Constance Pierce left Wyoming the day after the verdict, never to return. And slowly, painfully, Silver Creek began to heal. Jake recovered over the course of 6 weeks. His shoulder healed, though it would always carry a scar from the beam that had nearly killed him. Doc Warren said he was lucky to be alive. Grace said he was too stubborn to die. During his recovery, Grace ran the ranch. She managed the accounts, organized the rebuild of the barn, coordinated with the ranch hands. She proved herself capable of running the entire operation, and the men respected her for it. Matthew, racked with guilt over Jake's injury, worked twice as hard as before. He appointed himself Jake's personal nurse, bringing him meals, helping him with exercises. Doc Warren prescribed sitting with him for hours and learning everything Jake could teach him about ranching, about life, about being a man. "You saved my life," Matthew said one afternoon. "You could have died." "You would have done the same for me," Jake said. "That's what family does." Matthew looked up, his eyes shining with tears. "Are we family now? Really?" "If you'll have me," Jake said. "If your mother will have me." 3 days later, when Jake was finally strong enough to stand, he found Grace in the kitchen preparing dinner. The children were outside playing in the evening sun. They were alone. "Grace," he said. She turned and her face lit up the way it always did when she saw him now. "You shouldn't be out of bed yet." "I couldn't wait any longer." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. I need to ask you something, and I need to ask it now before another disaster strikes, or another villain appears, or another beam falls on my head." Grace laughed, tears already forming in her eyes. "Grace Whitmore, will you marry me not as an arrangement, not as an employer and employee, but as two people who love each other and want to build a life together? You and me and all our children. A real family." Grace's tears spilled over. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jake, I'll marry you." He pulled her close and kissed her, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Coming to Wyoming, taking the risk, trusting this man with her heart. They were married 4 weeks later in Reverend Thomas's church. The entire town turned out. Martha Hayes cried. Doc Warren beamed. The ranch hands cleaned up and sat in the back rows grinning. Grace's children stood with her at the altar. Rebecca held Lily. Emma held Oliver's hand. Matthew stood beside Jake, and when the Reverend asked who gave this woman to be married, Matthew said in a clear voice, "Her children do." Jake's vows were simple and perfect. "Grace, I promise to love you and your children for the rest of my life. I promise to be the father they deserve and the husband you need. I promise that our home will be built on honesty and respect, and the kind of love that chooses to stay even when things are hard." Grace's vows echoed his. "Jake, I came to you with nothing but children and shame. You gave me everything: a home, safety, respect, love. I promise to be your partner in all things. I promise to stand beside you in every fight. And I promise to love you not because I have to, but because I choose to, every single day." When they kissed, the church erupted in applause. That night, Jake finally opened the door to Thomas's room. Grace stood beside him as he looked at the small bed, the toys of life that had been cut short. "I'll always love them," Jake said quietly. "Sarah and Thomas, they'll always be part of me." "I know," Grace said, "and that's how it should be." Jake turned to her. "But I'm ready now, ready to fill this house with children again, ready to build something new." "Then let's turn this into Emma's room," Grace said. "She's been wanting her own space." Jake nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, that's exactly right." They worked side by side to transform the room, packing away the things that were too painful, keeping the things that honored memory without being trapped by it. And when they finished, they stood in the doorway and looked at what they had created. A room for a living child. A future built on the foundation of the past, but not imprisoned by it. Over the next year, the ranch prospered. They rebuilt the barn bigger and stronger. They expanded the herd. They hired more hands. Grace's recommendations for efficiency proved sound, and profits increased steadily. Matthew grew tall and strong, working beside Jake every day. He smiled now freely and often. Rebecca blossomed into a confident young woman, teaching school part-time and helping Grace manage the household. Emma turned the ranch into a menagerie of rescued animals. And one spring morning, a year after the wedding, Oliver finally spoke. His first words were to Jake. "Pa," he said clearly. "Can you teach me to ride?" Grace cried. Jake gathered Oliver into his arms and carried him outside to the corral, where they picked out a gentle horse for the boy's first riding lesson. That evening, as Grace watched her family gathered around the dinner table, she felt a peace she had never expected to find. Her children were happy, they were safe, they were loved. She had arrived in Silver Creek with nothing but shame and 5 hungry children. She had been rejected, scorned, threatened. She had faced down a powerful man and won. But more than that, she had learned the hardest lesson of all. That strength wasn't refusing help. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. That love wasn't weakness. She had arrived with nothing. She had built everything, and it was enough. More than enough, it was everything.